And let's talk about country ownership. Sorry, it took us a minute to get started. There was some technical challenges here on ground getting things started in Brazil as things would happen. Uh, but now we have a few minutes to talk about evidence and country ownership. Country ownership is central to the mandate of many of our organizations in which all of us work in different ways. But there's very little evidence on country ownership itself. And with that in mind, the board of the Green Climate Fund, where I uh, asked us to evaluate the GCF's approach to country ownership. And that's what we did. And that's the opportunity we have today to present to you an evaluation, the findings and recommendations from an evaluation on GCF's approach to country ownership. My very esteemed panelist is Mr. Rishabh Modgil, who's an evaluation and policy specialist at the Green Climate Fund's Independent Evaluation Unit. Besides evaluations, he also looks after policy, liaison with board members, and among many other things that he does. And walk us through the key findings and recommendations of this important evaluation. Rishabh, take us away.
Thank you, Archie, and thank you for holding the fort in Belém. Good evening from the headquarters of the Green Climate Fund in Songdo, South Korea. I am Rishabh Modgil, the Policy and Evaluation Specialist at the IEU, and I'm pleased to present the independent evaluation of the GCF's approach to country ownership. To collect data, we undertook around 149 interviews covering a purposive sample of 10 countries, including 2 deep dives with Belize and Ethiopia, with the aim to inform the review and development of the GCF's future guidelines on country ownership. This evaluation has been submitted to the GCF's board and will be tabled in early 2026. I will now introduce the findings in 4 specific areas before presenting the conclusion and recommendations. I should try to wrap this up within 12 to 15 minutes. With this, let's begin. So, what's the narrative and the discourse of country ownership globally? The global narrative has shifted in emphasis and depth. What began with the Paris Accord and the Accra Declaration in the early 2000s has matured. The discourse is moving from country ownership to country leadership, and the GCF itself is both evidence of and a catalyst for the demand for country ownership in climate finance. We find positively that developing countries exercise collective ownership over the GCF through formal, procedural, and substantive channels, thereby making the fund a country-driven institution which is beyond just individual projects. We also find that the GCF aligns with the UNFCCC COP and CMA guidance on country ownership, showing strong alignment with evolving global norms and best practices in climate finance, particularly in terms of its commitment to direct access, to national leadership, to inclusive stakeholder engagement, and investment in institutional capacity. Let me now cover some structural factors underpinning country ownership. On its definition, we find that different parts of the fund, whether it is the guidelines or the investment framework or various strategies, have different operational definitions of country ownership. While this creates flexibility to implement the approach, it also creates inconsistent practice and unclear accountability. In practice, NDAs are the cornerstone of the GCF's approach to country ownership. The GCF's guidelines expect NDAs to have a mandate to follow a whole of government and the capacity to follow a whole of society approach. And the guidelines do not impose on the NDAs which approach to use and when, leaving the operationalization of country ownership entirely to the discretion of the NDAs. On direct access, in line with our previous evaluations, we find that direct access is useful, but does not guarantee country ownership. Firstly, DAEs, the direct access entities, are underused. Only a third of DAEs have approved projects. In the project portfolio, DAEs consistently account for only 20%. On the other hand, we find that international entities can provide strong alignment with national goals when they actively engage NDAs and support local systems. We also reviewed the NOL procedure that has been a key part of this evaluation. While NOLs provide NDAs with the opportunity to exercise country ownership and ensure alignments of FPs, NOLs by itself neither guarantees nor generates country ownership. We also find that NOLs do not guarantee a whole of government or a whole of society endorsement and have not been consistently used to effectively engage the NDAs. It is a project level procedure and cannot be expected to generate wholesale country ownership. Next slide, please. So, how is country ownership implemented in practice and seen from the perspective of countries? We find that country ownership is less a property of GCF projects and is rather better explained by factors of political economy context. There are many factors that determine the general ownership of a country's climate portfolio with the GCF. For example, the positioning of the NDA within the government and its capacity is an important determinant. Another determinant is the existing development landscape. For example, existence of predominant development agencies, the culture of development planning, and the vibrancy of the civil society in the country. These are intrinsic factors that affect country ownership, but are largely out of GCF's immediate sphere of influence. On oversight, despite being a shared responsibility of the accredited entities, the NDA, and the GCF Secretariat, the GCF's model has come to depend mostly on AEs to sustain country ownership in the post-approval and implementation phases. The GCF depends on AEs to leverage existing country systems and the extent to which they may engage government agencies as executing agencies or partners while implementing projects. And in some cases, the decision to use country systems involves trade-offs between building country capacities and ensuring policy compliance. Lastly, on stakeholder engagement, two intuitive dimensions must be mentioned here: the depth and the quality of stakeholder engagement, and how AEs are accountable to the NDA. Next slide, please. Finally, just to wrap up the findings, looking ahead, I want to cover now some forward-looking elements. Starting with regional presence of the GCF. It has the potential to advance country ownership and has generated a lot of expectations, some of which may be unrealistic. Empirical evidence does not support the premise that regional presence alone will improve access. Instead, access to the fund has structural constraints, which can only be addressed through structural changes. Moving on to country programs, there's a degree of uncertainty over its continuity. Some GCF staff members report that country programs are being phased out as a tool. Although not explicit, GCF has shifted its programming approach to supporting country platforms, which have gained increasing popularity among developing countries. Yet, with no definition and uneven uptake, the fund currently lacks a consistent programming tool that provides certainty and predictability for the development of the pipeline. We also find that the GCF has yet to fully define its own role on whether it is a passive recipient of projects or a catalyst of climate finance. And lastly, we find that the definition of country ownership still remains elusive. It is a quality of systems as a whole rather than an outcome of project layout procedures. The IU has developed a framework to understand country ownership, and we're going to share the link of this report in the chat in chapter 5 of this report, which I encourage you to read especially to see this framework. To us, country ownership can be understood by three factors. First, the macro level factors of the country, which includes its climate positioning, its microeconomic stability, and the broader geopolitical context. Second, the structural factors, such as the institutions, the policies, the frameworks in place, which create an enabling environment for climate finance to flow in the country. And lastly, the cultural factors, including the attributes of the communities that shape norms for collective action in the country. Cultural factors influence how decisions get made and who participates in them. Over here, I'm talking about inclusion. With this, I conclude the presentation on the findings. Now, let's switch gears as I move on to the conclusions and recommendations made in this evaluation. Next slide, please. On the first conclusion on GCF's policy architecture. Thank you. So the first conclusion relates to the GCF's policy posture on country ownership. The fund has several mechanisms: accreditation, readiness, no objection procedure, project engagement, but these operate more separately than together. If country ownership is indeed a social contract between countries, communities, and the fund has not yet fully clarified its own obligation in that contract or the role it intends to play in the wider climate finance architecture. In both documents, the GCF positions itself as a leader and a catalyst of climate finance. The Secretariat also guides countries and partners on strategies, policies, and portfolio. So to us at the IU, the GCF can also give a signal on what good country ownership looks like. We therefore recommended to the board to reaffirm country ownership as a guiding principle and clarify how it balances with other priorities, such as scale and private sector engagement. The Secretariat should then embed that principle into the DNA of the newly reformed GCF, defining clear roles for NDA, AEs, and itself, and developing a country ownership rubric or scorecard to guide tailored support. On the second conclusion, our second conclusion relates to how ownership is understood and practiced. The fund's efforts have not yet fully evolved into a sustained system of leadership and coordination. Institution building should become the cornerstone of the GCF's approach, building systems and not procedures. The Secretariat should set clear expectations for NDAs, adapt it to context, and link readiness support to institutional progress, creating incentives for coordination and learning. We also recommend reforms to the no objection procedure, particularly for multi-country projects, so NDAs receive project-specific information and maintain oversight. Moving on to the third conclusion and recommendation on inclusive and meaningful participation. Stakeholder engagement remains largely procedural currently, oriented towards compliance rather than meaningful dialogue. Our recommendation is specific to this moment in the GCF. As the GCF expands its regional presence and deepens its focus on the particularly vulnerable and the underserved, this is also the right moment to reinforce social dimensions of country ownership. Inclusivity, trust, and recognition of diverse voices should become the default feature. Therefore, we recommend that inclusion becomes a default feature of GCF operations, embedding participation within country platforms, by funding non-state actors, and finally, by setting minimum standards for consultation and engagement. And lastly, on pipeline foresight and access to GCF, this is the fourth and final area. Over here, despite progress, GCF processes are still perceived as unclear, lengthy, and unpredictable. Although the Secretariat's efforts at improvement have paid off, they must also contend with frequent changes to policies and procedures, which themselves create uncertainty and fatigue for partners. So we see an opportunism among partners as opposed to strategic use of GCF resources. So as the fund strives for speed, it should also aim for predictability, giving countries the confidence to plan strategically rather than opportunistically. We therefore recommend strengthening pipeline foresight so NDAs can anticipate opportunities early. And in a bold step, we recommend making direct access the default. For a project led by international entities, the Secretariat could perhaps record a short justification for why direct access was not possible. Over time, these justifications would highlight institutional gaps and guide future capacity support. With these four areas, architecture, system, inclusion, and access, I conclude my presentation to present the IEU's independent evaluation on GCF's approach to country ownership, which has been submitted to the board and will be tabled in early 2026. Archie, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Rishabh. That was very interesting and quick. I am biased. I was also part of the team that undertook this evaluation, so thanks so much. Before you go away, Rishabh, let me ask you a follow-up question. And this is interesting for us, is because you spoke of NDAs and NOLs and how NOLs alone will not guarantee nor generate country ownership. They don't guarantee whole of society, whole of government approach. And this has been of interest by this GCF. It's also a means. The no objection letter is also a means exercised by other entities, other agencies in the work that they do. What are the lessons? And can you speak a little bit more about that? Because you also, this evaluation also included country visits. So what's been the country level experience when you look at NOLs from the level of countries? What happens? Why does it not guarantee a whole of society, whole of government approach?
Archie, thank you very much. It's a very valid question. Maybe I want to begin with starting with the basics of what the annual procedure is, and then I can share some insights from what is actually happening indeed in practice. So to start with, the no objection procedure in the GCF requires a formal no objection letter, the NOL, from the NDAs for every project or program funding proposal submitted to the GCF. This ensures government concurrence that the proposal fits national climate strategies and plans. Hence, the annual procedure indeed operationalizes countries' consent for GCF financing. Setting the context, we found, however, that NOLs let me take it first. Let me take the whole of government approach first. That we found that NOLs do not ensure the whole of government approach, because in practice, Archie, we find that NOLs are usually prepared and signed within the NDA's host ministry without a guaranteed input from other line ministries. That only in some countries is there a formal interministerial process behind each NOL. And that line ministries sometimes only become aware of a project after board approves a project in some cases. So as a result, while NOLs guarantee a whole of NDA approach, it does not indeed guarantee a whole of government approach with all the line ministries involved in many cases. Let's switch gear to the whole of society approach when we talk about that. We found that stakeholder consultations are often linked with AE-led and compliance-oriented approaches, focusing on safeguards and gender rather than co-designing of investments. And we also found in particular a deep dive study that we particularly found in a deep dive study, I think I can name it, this was Belize, that civil society, indigenous peoples, women groups, subnational authorities, academia, local private sector actors are frequently absent from the NOL-related processes. And that NDAs have limited budget and guidance to run ongoing participatory processes as well. So therefore, the NOLs act as a narrow governmental clearance procedure rather. So in hindsight, NOLs by itself neither guarantees nor generates country ownership. It's simply a project level procedure to seek clearance from a government counterpart. So the no objection procedure cannot be expected to generate wholesale country ownership, Archie, which there could be a presumption about.
Thank you, Rishabh. That's super interesting. There's also some questions in the chat. But before I do that, I might turn to Giovanna very briefly. Giovanna Montagner, who's actually a consultant with Pastel. She's based in Mexico, but has helped many multilateral institutions, especially climate finance institutions, look at similar approaches and evaluate similar approaches, whether it's country ownership in the GCF or country engagement in the GEF and others. Giovanna, I want to turn to you very quickly. And from where you're sitting, how do all of these approaches sort of compare, and are there common lessons to learn across institutions?
Thank you. This is a great question. I would say all multilateral climate funds are prioritizing more and more country ownership and stepping up their efforts in this sense. There are, of course, different approaches tailored to the business models of each fund. We can see, for example, that direct access, which I also see in one of the questions in the chat, has been conceived also as a way of fostering country ownership at the GCF, but also in the Adaptation Fund, which was the pioneer in this area. Other ways that the funds have been working on this is through stakeholder engagement in different ways. So, of course, I would say that the focal points, NDAs, designated authorities play a key role in all the funds in terms of the gateway of country engagement, and they are expected to promote this broader government and stakeholder engagement at the social level. So I would say there are some key elements, but also specificities in terms of responding to the specific mandates and also governance of each of the funds. I don't know if I was able to respond to your question, Archie. Let me know.
Thank you so much, Giovanna. We've also got two questions, Giovanna, before you turn your mic off. We've got two questions in the chat. Let me read them out for the benefit of those in the room. So the question from Arunjana is there a taxonomy of country ownership or leadership that emerged, either inductively or deductively from your research? Also, is there value in collaborating with other development organizations in developing the kind of normative and operational clarity that you talked about? So that's one question about taxonomy. The question is essentially about taxonomy of ownership and leadership, and perhaps the models of leadership and ownership that we might see or might be able to exposit about. And the second question is from Bill. What is the perception of direct access at the institutional level? Will it require new M&E systems? That's a very profound question. Will it require a whole new architecture for M&E of direct access? Giovanna, do you want to take any parts of those two questions?
Yeah, I'll start with the taxonomy. This is also something we discussed as we approached this evaluation, because as evaluators, one of our first questions was, okay, so how do we assess this? How do we measure this? What indicators are there? And what we found is that at the GCF level, the closest to a taxonomy would be the country ownership investment criterion, which is used to assess funding proposals. This is part of a set of criteria that are used, so it's not the only one. It contains several dimensions which can be seen as indicators of country ownership. So at the portfolio level, we have these scores, these country ownership scores across these dimensions. But this is, of course, an ex ante and project level assessment. So it doesn't really speak to country ownership at the country level, for example, and it doesn't speak to country ownership at the implementation stage. So there are currently some limitations in terms of how we can really grasp country ownership in a more systematic and quantitative manner at the portfolio level. And based on this, one of our recommendations is also to consider developing some kind of scorecard for country ownership, that so that the GCF starts collecting more systematic data on this, and this would make it easier to track evolutions, challenges, best practices also across the different GCF recipient countries.
Thanks, Giovanna. Let me try and address some parts of that question too, as a member of that team that did the evaluation. Aranjana's question is a very profound one. How do we measure country ownership? What does it look like in different contexts? And so, for example, the portfolio of the GCF is so wide. We've got countries ranging from Bangladesh on the one hand to Belize on the other, and from Vanuatu on one hand to Ethiopia on the other. But, so country ownership looks very different from a context to context. In a context like Bangladesh, which is very there's a lot of civil society engagement, there's a lot of documentation, intense documentation of climate priorities, and a number of years of experience and decades of experience with development internally and with external partners. Country ownership can look very different than, let's say, Bhutan, with a planned economy where everybody looks to the 5-year plan to figure out their national priorities, and that determines what happens in development, but also in climate, which is very different from, let's say, Namibia, a much smaller country with a much smaller population and far more organization, but also as many great needs. So country ownership can actually look very different in all of these contexts, depending on the organization of the culture of the government, the culture of consultation, for example, that Rishabh mentioned, civil society vibrancy, transparency in the government, legitimacy of government actors and other actors, the space that they get for inclusion, and a whole lot of other factors. So we are not in the evaluation, we are sort of not organizing that as on a spectrum of good to bad, but we're saying that it can be understood by understanding the various factors, the social factors and cultural factors on the one hand, the hard policy factors, the policy infrastructure that's in place, and the macroeconomic factors, which is how many development partners are present, what do they do, how long they've been present for, what's in fact, and other things like the ODA status, the debt stress of the country, and other macroeconomic factors, including currency exchange rates, etc. So that can help us understand country ownership, and like Giovanna said, we can move countries on that spectrum by identifying some of the underlying principles of country ownership, which include very basic things like inclusion, transparency, collective action, and foresight of GCF pipelines and other pipelines with other agencies as well. Bill raises a very question about direct access and its acceptance at the institutional level. I think at the board or at the GCF's GCF was set up for direct access. So taking an example, taking the cue from Adaptation Fund, which sort of experimented with direct access in the space, the GCF was meant to scale it up. So there is not just a hope, but an expectation that the GCF will actually scale up direct access, and most of the GCF's funding and should be based, or the financial model should be based on direct access. However, in the evaluation, we find that only 20% of the GCF projects, no, 20% of the GCF finance goes to direct access, and it has consistently been 20%, and we see no specific measures or efforts in place to increase it more. the GCF's vision currently is of scale. It's a 50 by 30 vision that $50 billion should be under implementation by 2030, which means large projects would be favored, right? What that means is direct access, which tends to be smaller projects, will not be incentivized directly by the institution. So that's what the recommendation of the report says, that if in fact direct access is to be incentivized in the system, then there should be incentives for staff to promote direct access and take on these smaller, well, relatively smaller in terms of financial size, ticket size, but take on these projects and actually carry them out. I'm going to look at the chat once more. I think we're getting towards the end of the time that we have allocated towards allocated for us. I'm just going to give one last word to Giovanna and Rishabh in that order. If you have any concluding thoughts, Giovanna, first over to you.
Maybe only, and going back to the first question you asked me, I think it would be very interesting to look more systematically at how different multilateral climate funds are approaching country ownership based on this evaluation, but also other ongoing efforts in the other funds, and to more deeply explore what are the similarities, what are the differences, and what we can learn from each other on this.
Thanks, Giovanna. I think she's putting the plug for something that we haven't yet planned, but we should do a collective. I see Debbie in the audience nodding at this as well, that we should do a collective get-together, a virtual and online one, and share all of our findings in one common space. And there can be so much to learn from that. Yesterday, just to take 1 second on this, yesterday somebody commented from the audience that why does GCF have to reinvent the wheel as the newest organization? Why can it not use the experience that Jeff has for over 30 years and Adaptation Fund for over 10 years and start from there? Why does it have to then experiment with everything, document it, and then do it? So perhaps there's a lot of synergy to be realized. Rishabh, over to you for any concluding remarks, and then we'll close from there.
Thanks, Archie. As I close, I want to bring it back to the GCF and leave you with one message on country ownership. And this is about country ownership being a social contract. If indeed it is a social contract between the countries and the communities and the fund, then the fund now needs to spell out its own obligations in this social contract. I want to borrow the analogy from the fund's own analogy at the moment, that it says that if countries are in the driver's seat, it is up to the GCF to provide the map, the speed limits, and the fuel. Otherwise, countries are driving blind. That's why we recommended, as the first recommendation, for the board to reaffirm country ownership as a guiding principle, and then to clarify how it balances with other priorities such as scale and private sector engagement. And then following that, the Secretariat can then embed that into this new reformed GCF, trying to achieve 50 by 30 through delineating clearer roles, and as Giovanna mentioned earlier, with simple rubrics that signal what good country ownership looks like in practice, which is inclusion, coordination, and leadership. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be part of this panel and see familiar faces.
Thank you so much, Rishabh. In fact, if countries have to be in the driver's seat, can GCF and other institutions not provide the maps and the street lights to guide countries where they need to go and drive their own path? With that, we'll thank you, Bill. We'll close the session. We're 1 minute over. It took us a minute to get started, but we had a wonderful discussion anyway. Thank you so much, Rishabh. Thank you, colleagues online and in the room. Stay on for the other sessions that are following. Thank you.
Kamsahamnida.